afternoon, everyone. My name is Megan Weir. I'm a research fellow at the Centre for Social Impact. And it is my huge privilege to be moderating this discussion today, where we're focusing on designing and delivering Indigenous financial services with a really wonderful panel. So it's such a privilege to be here. But first, I'd like to acknowledge that today I'm on the lands of the Gadigal and Bidjigal people on a country where sovereignty was never ceded. All of us today are on lands where there are thousands of years of dynamic relationship and interaction, both between people and the land. So I'd like to pay my respects to elders past and present, and also extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people joining us today. Thank you for giving us this time. So when we talk about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and money or financial systems, this is often done through an inherent or unconscious deficit or problem lens. But when we're talking about something like financial services and approaches to money and wealth, we also need to be recognizing that concepts that I, as a white person, take for granted as the neutral norm, but they're actually really part of a system that has existed here in Australia for only the last 230 years. Regardless, we are still operating as a society that deals with wealth through things like money, investments, property, and financial services. So there is perhaps an inherent tension between how money and wealth systems could work for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and what financial services are currently available. So how can we transform systems so that they better meet the needs and values of Indigenous peoples? And during a global event such as COVID-19, are there inherent underlying issues in access to services that we are now seeing amplified in the face of a global recession? These are the kinds of issues that we'll be talking about today. I also want to acknowledge that I myself am not an Indigenous person, so I see my role here today as being able to guide a discussion, but it's really the perspectives of our panellists that we're looking forward to hearing today. I also want to recognise that going through our registration list, there's a huge wealth of knowledge and experience that attendees are bringing to this discussion. So definitely please feel free to add questions to the chat as they come up, or feel free to share your perspectives in the chat if you feel it's safe to do so. So as a bit of background, this panel came about primarily through some work that CSI, First Nations Foundation and National Australia Bank did together between 2018 and 2019, looking at Indigenous financial resilience, or the ability to bounce back from financial shocks. This culminated in a report called Money Stories that was released last year in May. And I know that we actually have some members of the advisory group that are joining us here today, including Linda, who is on our panel. So I want to say a special hi and thank you to those legends. So it's from this working relationship and experience of doing this research work together that opens up this opportunity to have a discussion today. So with that in mind, I'd like to introduce our speakers and first of all, get them to tell us about themselves. So who you are, where you're from and what you're doing, and where you are now and what you're doing. So Phil, I might pass over to you first.
Yeah, sure. Phil Usher, CEO of First Nations Foundation. Grew up in Tamworth, out in country New South Wales. Dad grew up in Tullamore area, outside of Dubbo. So the family's kind of Wiradjuri, but I grew up in town. I only been to Dubbo like 2 or 3 times. So I identify a lot more with the people in Tamworth. So I grew up there, moved to Newcastle, where I'm living at the moment, where I studied university, did some business and finance related courses. Had a bit of background in public service, 9 year in public service, working out of primarily Sydney in Redfern, managing an outreach team, Indigenous outreach team for Centrelink, which was really good role, really stressful. Some of the stuff that you see the fellas go through out there. Moved to business advisory and now in First Nations Foundation. And our focus is achieving financial prosperity for Aboriginal people throughout Australia.
Great, thanks Phil. Linda, how about you? Can you introduce yourself?
Thanks, Megan. Linda Edwards, so Wankamara Barkindji woman from far west New South Wales. I actually live in Narromine in central New South Wales, so land of the Wiradjuri people. I'd like to also acknowledge traditional owners on all the lands on which everyone's sitting at this particular time, and pay my respects to elders past, present, and particularly those emerging. And I'd also like to acknowledge my brothers and sisters also on this webinar. My role with Financial Counselling Australia is as a coordinator for financial capability, and that is around Indigenous financial literacy on a national level. So my history, work-wise, was a manager of a First Nations financial literacy program with Catholic Care Wilcannia Forbes out in top of New South Wales. My work there, we covered 52% of New South Wales and ran financial literacy engagement programs with our mob on the ground. Prior to that, I was a finance officer with the local Shire Council. So I've always worked in finance, and very happy to be on this webinar, and thank you very much for having me to participate. I do appreciate it.
Thanks, Linda. And finally, I'll pass over to Yvan. Hi, Yvan, introduce yourself.
Hi everyone, Yvan Little. I'm from Alice Springs, Central Australia. My mob, I'm Aboriginal through my mother's line, and I identify as Lurichipura as well as Central Arunta. So I have been living off my country for, I think, out of the Northern Territory for coming to close to 10 years. I met my husband in Alice Springs, and we ended up moving to Melbourne. So have been here since. I would also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of this land, and I live in the Mornington Peninsula, so I'm Bunurong country, and so I'd just like to acknowledge the traditional owners here, but also of traditional owners of other parts of the country where everyone is calling in from. And it was actually just really nice to see in the chat people saying hello and recognising, acknowledging the country that you know, that you're on. It was a really nice way to start, I think, the webinar. A little bit about me is I have been in NAB just over 7 months, Head of Indigenous Affairs and Strategic Inclusion. Prior to working in NAB, I've worked always in Aboriginal affairs in really the social welfare sector, and really jumped ship to corporate, my first corporate role, because I felt like there was more opportunity to be able to drive some of the bigger picture items in Indigenous affairs from a national scale. Prior to working in this role specifically, I was working as the Director of Client Services in the Victorian Aboriginal Childcare Agency, which is an Aboriginal welfare organisation working with vulnerable families. And, you know, obviously one of the key things that impacts on our mob is being able to manage money, access to finance, and I think and employment and opportunities to you know, get good jobs. So that's a little about me. I've also worked in the public service. But here I am, and it's really great to be here and be part of this panel with my colleagues here working in the space.
Thanks, Yvan. And I think I'd also like to just acknowledge for those living in Victoria at the moment that it is tough, and I know that you're Mornington Peninsula, Yvan, so a bit of a rough trot for people at the moment, and so I hope people are holding up okay in Melbourne and other parts of Victoria, and the rest of Australia is behind you and feeling sympathy for you for this year. So Linda, I might jump to you first and just ask you, can you tell us a bit about, you already went into this a little bit, but talking about the work that you do at Financial Counselling Australia and what issues or challenges you most often find yourself having to focus on in your work.
No worries, thanks Megan. I'd also like to acknowledge all our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander financial counsellors and capability workers. I've just scrolled through all of the frames and our networks on here, so that's amazing to see all you mob on here. So my work with Financial Counselling Australia, it's certainly in the first instance, it's to support services that employ financial capability workers on a national level. And so that's, you know, setting up a community of practice, you know, providing opportunities at our national conference for capability workers to get together, some unaccredited training as well. That's most of my role. And then also to deal with those systemic issues that come up through our national Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander financial literacy network. And look at you know, national advocacy in terms of those issues that we're seeing. Predominantly my work is really around that national advocacy work. So certainly working with financial services in terms of internal processes and procedures that, you know, we know don't work for our mob on the ground, particularly those living in regional and remote communities. You know, the fact is that someone can say to someone in a remote community from a bank, oh, you need to go to your local branch to confirm your identity. And they have to travel 3 and 4 hours, you know, to be able to get to a local branch, or they just don't get there. So, you know, they're actually excluded from a lot of the financial products. That's changing a lot too. And I'll talk a little bit about that, I think, in some of the questions that you're going to be giving me later on. I think for me, in working in this space around this national advocacy work, is the frustration that sometimes I feel, you know, trying to explain in an emotional and with feelings, the isolation and unfairness that happens to our people on the ground that don't have access to banking products or don't have access to, you know, suitable financial services. You know, your biggest hurdle is trying to get past all the risk and the legal units of those financial services. And I remember a conversation that I had one day while I was in Canberra at one of the government services, and I was talking to some people in their policy unit. And these are the people that write the policies around maybe some of the guidelines for funding or some of the policies around, you know, legislation that potentially can happen. But they're never involved in community consultation, and they don't actually get to see the raw emotion that people are actually, you know, when they're feeling frustrated or they're feeling angry because they feel like they're not being heard, and it doesn't, the conversation from consultation doesn't then play into policy making. And, you know, and they basically said, yeah, we would actually like to be more involved in those because we're the ones that are writing it. We get secondhand knowledge, but we don't get the emotion side of it. So that's always a real challenge. You know, most of my work is supporting our financial counsellors and capability workers that are working predominantly on the ground with our mob. You know, these people are doing amazing work in their communities. I can't say enough around, you know, the financial counsellors and the capability workers that are on the ground, sometimes working in silos, working alone, sometimes, you know, having just inundated with clients and having long waiting lists. And just, you know, trying to set up that community of practice where we can regularly share. We have an email network where people can post questions or we can share information, which has been really helpful. We get together once a year at our conference, both the financial the ATSI network and also the capability network, you know, and so just really trying to explain to financial services and government the need for more financial counsellors and capability workers in this space. You know, and particularly those that are in remote communities, that the length and breadth of land and area that they have to cover to serve people is just, it's mind-blowing. It's absolutely mind-blowing.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And I think what has been really valuable from sort of conversations that I've had with you and then also work that we were able to do with Money Stories was, you know, actually hearing those stories from financial counsellors on the ground, and then also hearing experiences of customers that haven't been able to access a service, or, you know, their name wasn't spelt right by the person opening the bank account for them when they were opening it. And I think, you know, it's probably just those kinds of events that most of us aren't aware of and don't really know about. But as you say, it's that emotion behind the stories that are so important to kind of identifying where there's a need for change. So yeah, I think hopefully that is something that people are getting out of this webinar today as well. So the stories like that are really helpful. So then I guess we've got the financial counselling network that Linda's speaking at, and then shifting up to a level, going to more the financial services. Yvonne, I might ask you, what are the main issues that your team at NAB focus on, both in working with customers, but also in the recommendations for changes in services to the bank?
Yeah, I think the three key issues that I think Aboriginal people quite at a higher level continue to experience and address is, is unequal economic participation in the market. There continues to be a disproportionate number of Indigenous people employed in Australia, and there continues to be a disproportionate number of Aboriginal people who own their own businesses compared to other Australians. I think that's one particular issue that I see and that NAB is working on. There's three. The second one is the small numbers of Indigenous people who have good financial health and who are able to build wealth. Having access to finance, understanding the finance system, being able to make informed decisions about money, and getting approval for loans. And, a lot of our mob live week to week, and that's just something that we do. And, interestingly, when I started at NAB, I used to live week to week, and I learned all this information around financial health, and I'm like, geez. So I was ringing up my girlfriends and family and saying, you've got poor financial health, did you know? You can be an educated Aboriginal person as well and not really understand money. So I think across the spectrum that's a real area that for development for Indigenous people, and that's an area that we focus on. The other particular issue I think that I see is low representation of Indigenous people working in finance and banking, and it's great to see, as Linda pointed out, the number of Aboriginal people here on the call who are actually working in finance, because we need more of our own mob to be able to understand the system, to be able to support people, to be able to, make better choices, manage money better. But also, we also need Aboriginal people working in corporates and in finance, and who can drive those conversations and take leadership and then take that information back to community. And, it's good to see Phil as CEO of First Nations and Linda in those senior roles doing that work. So they're the three key issues that I see as important. I think that NAB focuses on. In Indigenous Affairs, we have an elevated RAP plan, and we have three key focuses. One is building the economic participation of Indigenous people in Australia. The way we do that is we invest in financial programs developed by Indigenous people for Indigenous people, and we're actually in the process of working with First Nations to be able to get some licences out free of charge to community organisations as well as their members, as well as Aboriginal businesses, to be able to help understand, think about money. We also offer, access to no interest loans for Indigenous people through our Good Shepherd partnership across Australia. We get a lot of uptake. Those in that particular example, we have at least 20 to 25% of uptake of those loans by Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people, which is great, and they don't actually need to come into a bank, so they can apply for that funding, that money, that loan through through the community organisation they work with. So it really takes out some of that fear and some of those barriers about going into a bank and having that conversation around money. We're supporting the development of an insurance project with SVA, which is around funerals. Sensitive conversation, I know, for our mob, but something I think we need to be looking forward to the future, because when people pass, it costs us a lot of money, and sometimes it's pulling in money from different ways at the last minute. So how that plays out, I'm not sure in community with sorry business, but important program to do. So that there's some of the things that we do in building the economic participation. And also, I should probably give our Indigenous customer service line a plug. We have an Aboriginal line at NAB that any Aboriginal person can call, and you'll receive, on the end of that call, you'll receive people who are trained to work with Aboriginal people, who have extra time to sort through conversations and can help you with all sorts of and resolve problems that you may be experiencing, that you wouldn't necessarily get the same service from other parts of the bank just because of the way the business runs. So look, that's really good. I think, the other thing we do is invest in Indigenous people internally in leadership, but also in the business sector. So some of the things that we do internally is we have employment and traineeship programs for Aboriginal people. We're looking at building out our leadership opportunities so we can support Aboriginal people and Torres Strait Islander people to rise through the business so that they're in decision-making positions and there's leadership, you know, and we also offer skilled volunteering to support Aboriginal corporations, but also, you know, one of the key things we're also involved in is working with Jarwin, and we've just had our 200 secondee go to an Aboriginal or support an Aboriginal community with a business problem, and that's something we are super proud of. And we have, with the move to working online virtually, we've had the increase in numbers of people within NAB has significantly increased. So there's lots of interest in the organisation and the business to be able to you know, support Indigenous business and Indigenous corporations in terms of leadership building as appropriate and as identified by the community. And look, the other thing we do, we work on is cultural intelligence, and that really is around supporting people in NAB to understand the history of Aboriginal people and understand the needs of Aboriginal people as it comes to finance, and that's also a big part of our work. So, yeah.
I love that. Yeah, and I love especially that it's kind of the responses in terms of the programs or opportunities that are being put forward are so driven by what has been identified in the community, and that's where kind of these networks with First Nations Foundation and FCAN and things like that are so important as well, right? Because that's how you hear about whether something is working or not.
Yeah.
That's great. Thank you for that. Yeah, Linda.
You could just jump in really quickly in terms of that. So, yeah, I think everything that Van is saying is certainly true of NAB, and particularly the people that I've worked with in NAB. One of the, I think, one of the things that some of the banks are doing is actually going out on the ground and visiting those remote communities. And I know that NAB was one of those banks that actually did go out and talk to people on the ground to be able to get an idea about, you know, how their products are working or what's best served for community. And I think, you know, for financial services, for them to be able to go out and actually go into community and get a feel for the community rather than just, I mean, I can talk till the cows come home and tell them what's going on the ground, but they're not going to feel, you know, what's actually going on until they sort of go out and do that on the ground. And, you know, sometimes, you know, it's really hard for some of those services. And I'm talking about, you know, not people that are in the community engagement teams, but I'm talking about executives that actually make the decisions. The decision makers really do need to go out on the ground and talk to people to find out if their products are actually working and if their systems are working. Because one of the things that people sort of say is, you know, First Nations people don't understand money. I can tell you, we understand money. We know how to use money. It's the systems and processes that are in place that actually make it really hard for us to be able to participate.
Yeah, yeah. And yeah, I think especially being kind of, it's got to be at the executive level where the decision making and the systems are set up, or where there's space to change, that's really important. So that's great. I might jump to you, Phil, just because, you know, I was going to ask about what First Nations Foundation do and why is the work that you do so necessary?
Yeah, so we're probably a good mix between sort of the community and the financial service industry. You know, we sort of consult with the financial service industry and help create products and services that really resonate with community. We really have that cultural lens. So one of our flagship products, Big Super Day Out, we've been running that for the last 6 years. And what we do there is we take Centrelink, we take the tax office, take super funds and financial counsellors, and they'll go out to Aboriginal communities and help them find their superannuation that they didn't know they had. So we've been doing that for 6 years now. And the tally we've found is it's had over 24 mil in super that we've reconnected Aboriginal people to. And the way that the reason that it works is we kind of, because everyone's trying to do something good. Like we've got these super funds. We take about 15 super funds out there. The banking industry is trying to do well, but the last thing community needs is 15 super funds all trying to do their own thing in different communities, because it just gets too overwhelming and it's kind of too much. So what we do is if we can bring a coordinated approach to that service delivery element, so it's less intimidating and it's less overwhelming, we can have a lot more impact. So our big Super Day Out event is definitely one of the ones, that we're really known well for. However, this year, the first year in 6 years, we haven't been able to run it due to COVID and not being able to go out to community. So we've put that online, indigenousssuper.com.au. We launched that probably about 2 months ago now. And that's a real high level, culturally appropriate way for Aboriginal people to engage in super. It goes through our 5-step plan of understanding what super is. And then we've got a little ebook they can download on how to navigate MyGov and find any superannuation that, that they might have out there. So for us, it's, our strength is working with people that sort of have a foundation. We're not so much on that really financial distress area, because there's a lot of services and a lot of really good services out there that focus on those areas. Ours is for this almost a rising middle class that's sort of coming up. We're seeing the government push for Aboriginal people to go into employment, which is really cool. And they're going up the ladder in employment as well. They're not just entry level. They're kind of going up to sort of middle management and senior management. And for the first time, we're seeing Aboriginal people have a bit more money left over each fortnight. And we don't have that access to understand kind of what to do with it. And I remember this was a real light bulb moment for me. I was talking to one of my non-Aboriginal friends who's really good with money. He's just one of these people that knew how to invest in like 22, like no one does. And I was talking to him. I said, how do you know how to manage money? And he said that his grandmother had this system, and it was just a 3-envelope system. Granddad would bring home the pay. 60% would go into one envelope for kind of your household expenses, everything. 20% would go towards kind of fund money and vacations. And 20% would go to investments or kind of government bonds. And that's something that's just kind of passed down through their family on how to manage money. And I remember it was probably a few weeks later, I was doing some outreach in La Perouse in Sydney. I was talking to one of the aunts here, and she was saying how when she used to work, she had to get a medical assessment to say that she was clean enough to work next to non-Aboriginal people. And these two women are kind of the same age. So we've got one where you fight to earn money. And this other one's got quite a sophisticated investment system. So for us, we're trying to plug that gap where most people in their family have someone to ask about money. How do I invest in shares? How do I get an investment property? How do I buy my first home? But Aboriginal people don't necessarily have that. And there's not a lot of knowledge in the community how to really build that wealth once you start to earn some really good income. So we've got a lot of training products around that. We've got a product called My Money Dream that kind of walks through that basics of budgeting. And then we'll go into certain areas like superannuation, insurance, banking basics, buying a home to try and push more people into that. We see wealth as sort of a continuum. It's kind of ever. It's just endless. You've got people on the far left side that are just struggling and making ends meet. But we see people go to the far right side. They might have a good job and they might have high income, but something will happen, like the mining site will close or the construction site they're working on will finish, and they'll be on 150, 200,000 a year. But then they quickly go back to the other side because they haven't got a head on their mortgage, or they haven't saved any money for emergency, or they haven't invested or anything. And simply because it's not part of the dinner conversation for a lot of Aboriginal families. So we see ourselves as really focusing on that area and kind of working between, community organisations as well as some of the financial service industries as well.
Yeah, and the My Money Dream subscription is what Yvan was mentioning earlier, wasn't it, Yvan? So that's really great that there's that kind of link there. I mean, do you feel like there's enough recognition, and this is a question for all three of you, I suppose, do you feel like there's enough recognition or knowledge in the wider financial space, or even just in Australian society in general, of like why there's this gap in terms of financial literacy or sort of like passed down knowledges around managing money and things like that? Do you think that's being like adequately recognized when there are conversations about Indigenous financial matters or wealth and prosperity and things like that?
I'm happy to answer.
Yeah.
There you go.
I had an experience of this like no other. Firstly, I think that the true history of Australia, and particularly First Nations people, is really lacking in this country. Our kids know more about American Black history than they do about Australian Black history, and that's a real concern for me, that the true history of this land has not been told, that this land has never been ceded to the you know, when we were first, you know, invaded, in terms of, you know, what happened to our people. And this notion of, oh, that happened years ago, you've got to get past that, you know, the intergenerational trauma that, you know, our people are still facing today because of that barrier of, you know, being able to participate in the economy, to be marginalised, and just there was no intergenerational wealth transfer whatsoever. We saw that when, you know, our people went away to war, and, you know, and when soldiers come back from the war, they were given land parcels as part of, you know, them fighting for our country. Aboriginal people, First Nations people, were never given land back in terms of that. They basically still had to go back to the mission. So it's this, barrier that actually is. And in terms of the conversation that I had, I went to, I did some policy, some work in Canberra at Parliament House. And I went into one of the offices, and it just happened to be, I think she was the whip for the Liberal Party. And she was talking about, you know, people have to take responsibility for their own lives. Parents have to teach their kids about money, you know, all of this, you know, like they say, your own self-determination. And I sort of like, myself and my colleague Roseanne, we were sort of like talked at for like 10 minutes by this person. And then at the end of the 10 minutes, she had to go. And I just sort of said, look, can I just say something in terms of what you've just said? And she said, yeah, sure, for sure. I said, well, my parents never taught me about money. She goes, why not? They should have. And I said, well, they were never taught about money. And she goes, well, why weren't your parents taught about money? I said, because my grandfather was paid in rations. He wasn't allowed to participate in the economy. You know, money in our family is only just come in from my mum and my dad, because like they're in their 80s, so they were allowed to work, you know.
Yeah.
And so, you know, this notion that everyone's going to be, you know, their parents are going to teach their kids about money, it just doesn't happen in terms of for First Nations people, because one of the things that we have to realise is that money has only been, and participation in the economy has only been around for First Nations people for just on 3 generations. Yeah. So, you know, like not even 100 years when you think about it, that we've really been able to participate in the economy. So for non-Indigenous people that have had money in their lives for, you know, hundreds, possibly thousands of years, to, you know, a whole society of people that have only been able to participate in the last 100, 150 years is a bit different. And the expectations, I think, are a bit too high in terms of that. And so getting back to my point is that she goes, oh, I'm really sorry, I didn't know about that. We should do something about that. Yeah.
Amazing insight.
I just think that generally people don't really realise that type of information, and we're not taught about that stuff. And one of my biggest bugbears that I have is that financial literacy is not a core subject at our schools.
Yeah.
That's something that I really want to push. I want to be able to have financial literacy, not at a high school level. I think that you needed to have it at a primary level, you know, year 5, year 6, where, you know, routines and where, you know, cycles, you know, can actually then maybe, you know, cease or stop or, you know, change direction, whatever. So that's, you know, one of the things that I am really, really passionate about.
One of the comparisons that I like to make with it, you look at Australia versus Europe, and how they, you know, you look over in Europe and all the empires that they used to have. You know, British Empire had to run, Roman Empire, there was an Ottoman Empire. They all had to go at this massive land acquisition and try and expand their borders. But I don't know if you've seen that map of Australia, how there's like 500 different tribes in Australia. There was never like a Wiradjuri Empire or a Bundjalung Empire or anything. No one was out there trying to get as much land. We all kind of worked with what we had. We kind of just lived within sort of our areas. There were wars and they fought each other at times, but there was no pig trying to, you know, have these castles and dominance. And when we did our research last year, the My Money Stories, one of the questions that stands out all the time is, you know, what's wealth or comfort look for you financially? What's that look like? And for non-Aboriginal people, it was to own a boat, which would be pretty cool, don't get me wrong. But when we asked Aboriginal people that, it was just a fridge full of food. So, you know, if family come around, you'd be able to look after people and they can take some food if they needed it. So even hundreds of years later, that's still that European kind of background is asset acquisition. And for us, it's just kind of to live, you know, within where we are and look after family and stuff. So even the whole mindset and the perception of money and assets and the need for it is very, very different.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think just on that, and, you know, I think a lot of Aboriginal people, you talk about building wealth, but we've just got enough money to get by. And and you don't inherit money, you don't necessarily inherit assets. And hopefully in the future that we will be in a position to be able to do that for our kids and our grandkids. But generally speaking, that's not something that occurs. So it is very different. And, you know, I think, one of the great things about Aboriginal people is our strong kinship systems and the need we share money and we look after each other. So if someone earns more money than others, they might, you know, potentially pay for kids in the family to go to school or for a new pair of runners or get them some tucker or whatever. So the value, how we use our money and the priorities we place on money can be different. They're not always different, but they can be different. And part of that is because there's not a lot of money in Aboriginal community, you know, so you've got to make it stretch, and you've got to, with the kinship system, there generally is that family obligation that you care for your family. And I think that's one of the reasons as well, I think, why there's not a lot of wealth. I think that people don't know that. They don't, a lot of the general community doesn't even know about stolen generation, you know, the stimulation policies which devastated Aboriginal communities and families. So like that's a big thing, you know, right? And so and it caused major trauma and has major long-term issues in Aboriginal families and communities now, where, you know, see the loss of language and just disempowerment of Aboriginal people. But like then you think, do they even understand about money? Like they don't necessarily understand about some of those bigger picture things that have had such an impact on Aboriginal people.
Yeah, and I think that was it was definitely one of the key messages that came from the Money Stories report, in terms of, you know, how is it that we think about wealth, or sort of what expectations as non-Indigenous people are we putting on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in the ways that they should be behaving with their money. A couple of questions that have come in that kind of relates to that point then is sort of, in your minds, and I know that this is incredibly tricky, and, you know, to solve this in a generation or even a webinar is totally not possible, but how is it in your mind that you could see adapting or kind of recognizing the value of kinship systems and Indigenous approaches to wealth, but also recognizing that a dominant system at the moment is primarily Western and sort of based on that asset accumulation? Like, is it possible to kind of make a compromise between the two, or make one work within the other? Like, do you have any thoughts about, all three of you, in terms of how that could work?
Yeah, it's a concept that kind of gets talked about a bit, kind of walking in two worlds, where you've got to, you know, do your corporate stuff and, you know, do what you have to do at work. And then you've got that community obligation aspect of it as well. One of the things I just try and, you know, work with Aboriginal people around is there's no shame or embarrassment around building wealth at the moment. You know, there's some, you know, there's some shame around it sometimes. You think you're kind of big noting yourself, or you're trying to show people up if you're building wealth. But I remember doing a talk down in Geelong and threw out the concept of, you know, creating more Indigenous millionaires, which is such a foreign concept for Aboriginal people, because you just, I don't know, you've got this negative belief, you feel you don't have the right to do it. You know, you've been told that you're, you know, not, you know, don't have the money skills to be able to do that. But it's just kind of saying, you know, you can still, you know, live a life that's true to your culture, still practice your culture. I've got, you know, fellas that back at home where they'll go out bush for, you know, a week or two, and then they'll go back working at the university and earn some decent money. So you can kind of, it's okay to blend the two, and it's okay to acquire assets and build wealth. There's absolutely nothing wrong with it. It's just that kind of self-worth that you have to build up and kind of go through.
Yeah, for sure.
So
I think on that point too, you know, like, I think there's real great strengths in the kinship system. Like, people have a responsibility for looking after and caring for their family, right? So if you say to someone, you put some money aside, tomorrow money, you know, you use the language for your grannies when they grow up, if they want to go to school and they, you know, might need some shoes or whatever, they'll go, oh, that's a good idea. So if you can understand the values and priorities of Aboriginal people and get them to think about money that is in a way that's important to them, as well as maybe you might want to buy a house one day or a new car, like whatever their aspiration is. I think, and then you'll benefit your family. Your kids can take it. You can go bush and get tucker for community. Like there's a whole bunch of things that the kinship system will support in terms of you know, getting better or just changing the way we think about money or supporting people to make informed choices about money. And I don't know that we have that in place yet. So I really think there's that room for financial literacy at a base level. But then there's also the conversations around, well, what's financial health? Well, financial health is having some money in the bank. You know, when your car breaks down, you can get it fixed. It's not as if to sit in the yard for a period of time, or if something comes up, you know. But in saying that, then you've got to have the money to be able to do that. So it's tricky, but definitely there is room to draw on the strengths of Aboriginal culture and behaviours, and you know, and to think about creation of wealth, but also to create money for tomorrow.
For sure.
So in terms of what I think about this is our cultural obligation is our greatest strength. We don't want to lose that. We don't want to have to think that we can't look after family or community, and it's not just blood family. It's you know, skin family as well. The challenge is around you know, I think the conversation that needs to be had with individuals and what they think that they would like to be able to do. I did a talk about humbugging a couple of years ago, and I said the same thing. You know, cultural obligation is our greatest asset. It's also one of the things that it really will keep us, you know, from not participating fully in the economy, and that's because we have our own social economy in some of our communities, First Nations people. We will never starve in our communities. We will always have family that will look after us, that will feed us, that will give us a bed, whatever. The challenge for us is how do we go about sharing money when by giving money away, we're creating hardship for ourselves.
Yeah.
So that conversation that really needs to really happen with individuals, because some people might want to be able to do that. I think that the challenge for us as First Nations people is when it's not reciprocated. So if you're giving money to family, but that family's not actually then assisting you, that's when the harm happens. But I know I have family members that I can give money to, and that will give me the money back.
Yeah.
You know, that's fine. It's part of our own social economy that we have. So, you know, in terms of financial services, one of the things that I found really difficult when I first started working as a financial counsellor is those services don't have a process in place where, or even a hardship form that has money for families, because you're not going to be able to stop someone from being able to assist with another family member who may be going through it hard. So having a form that, you know, having their hardship forms or their statement of financial position to actually include money for families would be something that, you know, I think a lot of people would be happy to do, because to be able to fill in and be able to tell a fair and honest story of their financial situation without having to say, oh yeah, but I give my family so much money, but I shouldn't put it on here, because then they'll say, why are you giving your family money?
Yeah, when you have this bill or something. Yeah. But I think what's interesting with that as well is, you know, that kind of experience of giving family money and then having sort of financial hardship yourself is not necessarily a uniquely Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander experience, but it sounds like it's one that is, the systems that are currently set up at the moment are disproportionately impacting Indigenous peoples. And so that's kind of what we're talking about here. I wanted to also ask Linda, I mean, you were so instrumental in the Royal Commission into the banking sector, just in terms of understanding how Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have been targeted by inappropriate insurance and loan companies. Can you tell us a bit about that and like what happened? And also, do you think there's been a change in these practices since 2018?
Yeah, thank you, Megan. I mean, I only looked good because of the Maxi network, who like is my support behind the scenes that a lot of people probably don't see. We have a very proactive network that are an amazing bunch of financial counsellors and capability workers. But in terms of the Royal Commission, I think my testimony was really about a few things. It was really the importance of some services of putting profit over people. Using limited financial literacy to be able to sell products, and using cultural obligation to sell some products as well, particularly funeral insurance that we saw. The ease of some of the government services, and I'm talking about centre pay here, that allowed people to be able to rot the system and be able to put people further in hardship. And a lot of the internal processes and policies were really not fit for purpose for First Nations people. We know that, you have to confirm your identity, but if you live a long way away from a local branch, that's never going to happen. So how are banks, why is the onus back always on the customer to be able to figure out a way to get that fixed? Particularly people that are vulnerable and that, have limited experience with financial literacy. I think, that it was really an interesting process for me. The biggest thing that came out of the Royal Commission was the challenges around identification for First Nations people. And that's to this day is still a really big issue. We know that Commissioner Haynes sort of, I was a little bit disappointed in a way that, some of the recommendations were a suggestion that financial services should go this way, or a suggestion that financial services should go that way. Would have been good for a clear and concise, recommendation that one of the examples was that superannuation companies, could possibly use the Australian guide for identification for First Nations people. It would have been good for it to say that all financial services should use the Australian guide in terms of identification. The challenge around the Australian guide is how then financial services interpret that guide. Is the interpretation going to be fair and reasonable for people on the ground? Is it going to be something that could harm them and have a flow-on effect that then harms their family and their community? Or is it going to be a good thing? So at the moment, the challenges around financial services using the Australian guide is around how their risk and legal services then interpret that guidance. And that's always going to be, at the moment, it's not actually working for people on the ground. The other thing that I was really disappointed with the Royal Commission is that it didn't take into account all of those other financial services that aren't regulated. We really touched a little bit on it in our testimony for Nathan and I, in terms of the consumer lease companies and payday lenders. We would have really liked to have been able to have a lot more conversation about that. We know that we have, at the moment, government is still holding on, and if anyone could nod to me if they know this, but the small credit contract legislation is like nearly 2 years that have been sitting with the government, and no decision has been made to that at this time, which actually puts in place some processes and really clear processes for those type of financial services to really look at, the charges that they make. So, it's really, it's still a fight. It's,
for sure.
Because of, I think those people that sort of, particularly at that executive level and in those policy and legal units, really don't see what life is like in community. It's like politicians, they live in their little bubble in Canberra, and for them, they probably know a lot about their own electorate that they work in, but they wouldn't know a lot about what actually is happening in other electorates. And to actually see that some of the issues for First Nations people isn't just about regional and remote communities, it's for all First Nations people. Yeah. Identification is one of the biggest issues that we're dealing with at the moment.
Yeah, thanks, Linda. We're sort of moving into the Q&A time, and people have been sending through their questions already. And I think some of the things that we've talked about have kind of touched on them. And so we'll get to the questions that we can. But Phil, I also just will ask you before we get into the Q&A, from what you've been seeing with the work with First Nations Foundation, and this applies to you as well, Yvonne, actually, what are you seeing as the biggest barriers for using or accessing financial services? What are things that you're hearing about consistently?
One of the things from that report, the My Money Stories, that said the reasons people don't access, whether it's financial planners or bank accounts or stuff like that, was just really awareness. They just didn't know that it existed, or they didn't quite know what to ask if they did, come into contact with someone from that area, which for me is a bit of a positive to come out of it, because that's not a difficult solve. Like, it shows that there's sort of some intention there, or there's some potential. And I remember when I was working out at Redfern doing community engagement there, it's funny because you're at the centre of Sydney, so access isn't an issue. You've got everything that you could possibly need there. It was just kind of awareness that you could access these services, or that you could go to Office of State Revenue and put a case forward and get your fines or your whatever, dismissed and get that off your debt record. So for me, I think it's a lot about just that awareness, because again, you don't know what you don't know in this space. Knowing that, if you've got an extra $5,000 in your bank account, you might be able to look at moving that towards a deposit for a home, or you might be looking at putting that to an investment. And again, as I said earlier on, our space is really specialising in that area where people have kind of got a bit of money and some wealth together, and accessing services and products from there.
Thanks, Phil. Yvonne, did you have anything you wanted to add?
Yeah, look, I think for me, just in terms of our Indigenous customer service line, we receive, I think just during the COVID period, it has been averaging between around 230 to 300 calls a month, sometimes up to 75 calls a week from Indigenous people looking for support. The key things, and I don't think this is going to be any surprise to anyone on this call, you've been blocked out of your account because you've had the wrong, you couldn't answer the identification questions, you forgot your PIN number, you've changed your phone number, so any kind of SMSs, you're not receiving, you don't have your 100 points of ID. They're really, you forgot your password, you've changed address. They're really the key things, I think, that people are calling for assistance through the Indigenous customer service line. And, we have things in place now, which is, I think, really progressive in terms of we can authorise people through non-standard forms of ID. So you don't have to have 100 points of ID. We will spend time talking to people to authenticate who they are, and in a way that is non-standard banking practice, because we have approval to be able to do that. So they understand the questions and they can give us the questions. They can give us the answers and we can authenticate them. We can also now open bank accounts for people who don't have 100 points of ID. Obviously, there are processes to follow, but these are things that we weren't able to offer, over 15 months ago, but we now offer now. And so most of those calls that come through, we're actually able to resolve those issues. Well, NAB is through the Indigenous customer service line, as well as working with other parts of the business. So I think that's, a lot of the calls are around some of those just banking 101, like the things that you need to be able to access your money. The other issue I see from a customer lens is just being able to support Indigenous small businesses, understand their needs, and to be able to provide a service that is appropriate for them. And that's something that NAB is looking at the moment in terms of what do we need to do to uplift our capability to be able to do that. So we have we have got a plan in place to be able to now look at that as kind of one of the next problems we need to address, and obviously that's listening to Indigenous businesses. So that is also, I think, an issue, and an issue that a lot of Indigenous businesses don't have capital to fall back on as well. So that, you know, we're trying to understand and then respond to the needs of Indigenous business to be able to build their capability, but also, you know, see their success. So I think they're probably the two key things that I would call out that we're seeing as you know, most common for Indigenous people contacting and requiring the service from our bank.
Yeah, and that kind of touches on a comment or a question from Kirsten, who asked if anyone has any experience or guidance around supporting Indigenous small businesses and dealing with financial bureaucracy, and, you know, how can you also navigate if there's previous trauma in terms of having negative experiences with other services and that serving as an impediment to actually like starting a small business? Is that something that, you know, you're seeing, or is something that needs kind of further attention in the kinds of services that are offered?
Absolutely. Yeah, that's something we've identified in NAB. We have also Indigenous advisory group which oversees our RAP plan. We have 3 senior leaders who sit on that with our senior leaders within NAB, and one of the key things we've identified is the need to be able to better respond and grow Indigenous small business. So absolutely, we're aware that we need to do more work in that area, and that's something that we are looking at the moment. So watch this space. You know, hopefully we can get to a place where we're offering a better service to Indigenous businesses, and you know, there are a couple of people on our panel, or sorry, on our Indigenous advisory group who are small business owners. So we're getting real insights from them as well in terms of what we could do. And then now we're exploring that. No promises yet, you know, but it is something that we are working towards, and we are really committed to building on.
Yeah, I think definitely that having people actually in that situation kind of contributing to that is really important, rather than just the execs coming down and saying what needs to be happening. I think that kind of leads to a question that I had, and it's something, you know, I acknowledge that I was feeling a bit nervous doing this panel today, just sort of being a non-Indigenous person myself, and, you know, what is it that I can, what's appropriate for me to kind of be asking about or sort of questioning. So I guess, what would you say, all 3 of you, what are some of the right questions or issues that non-Indigenous people should be asking when wanting to understand how Indigenous peoples use money and financial services? And how is it that we can respond or be asking these questions in a way that is respectful rather than patriarchal, or, you know, reenacting colonization, essentially? Just an easy question for you, Phil. I'll chuck to you first. I see you laughing.
Yeah. Well, gee, that's trying to solve that for 230 years.
Yeah.
I think the biggest thing is intent. Like when you go to community, and it's probably a bit broader than sort of the finance question, but always the intent, and make that clear. Because there's just this history of, you know, government or corporations wanting to know all your information, and that creates a history, and there's a history of lack of trust. So I think making your intent clear as to why you want this information or why you need it. One of the projects I ran out of Centrelink was getting people to identify that had a Medicare card. Because on our numbers, it showed that there was a really poor coverage, even in Sydney, real poor coverage of people that had Medicare cards or people that identified. And there was pushback to start with, because, you know, it was just another mechanism for the government to track your data and information. That we went in there with the intent to say that, you know, if we can find out who's got a Medicare card, it means we can find out who doesn't, or what pockets or what communities don't, so we can target services there. We can help people sign up. We can help people, you know, access the free medical services that they're entitled to. And then we see the massive, I think it was like 21% increase in people identifying in that area for Medicare cards. So I think, you know, at first it might be skeptical if you don't provide that context and the intent of what you're doing or asking those financial questions, because for anyone across the board to talk finance, it's kind of, you know, a bit taboo, or people are a bit nervous about it in general. So even more so in Aboriginal communities, if you make that intent really, really clear from the get-go, you'll generally have a better response and success rate.
Thanks, Phil.
I've certainly had this experience with financial services, and in particular with banks, around because we get the information at financial counsellors and stuff. We're always, speaking with the banks. We have a really good relationship with the banks. And one of the questions that I always ask, because they say, oh no, we do a lot of work. We really work with our Indigenous customers, and we think we do a really good service with our Indigenous customers. And I always say, well, how many First Nations customers do you have? And they go, oh, no, we don't collect that information. So how then do you know that you're properly and appropriately servicing First Nations customers if you don't ask? And they always say, well, we don't want to racially vilify people. We don't want to put them in a bucket. And my thoughts around that is exactly what Phil said. What's the intent? And so, if you're asking people to identify as Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander, you should be always saying, because we want to be able to know that we're better servicing, you as a First Nations person. We want to be able to build products that would be more suitable for you. Because I can tell you, as an Aboriginal person, we get asked for our Aboriginality from the time that we're born. Whenever we go to school, go to the doctors, go, anywhere where we're asked that. So it's not a question of that we don't want to identify. It's the fact is, well, what's the intent? What are you going to be able to use? Why are you asking me that question? And I know that there are a few of our regulators. AFCA is one of those who, will always ask people, TIO as well, because it's around catering their services to better support First Nations people in terms of that. So definitely it's the intent, and actually explaining that. The other ways that you can support people on the ground in terms of financial literacy is really just having an open and transparent conversation with them, and actually saying to them, what do you need? What do you think will? Because most likely the people that are in these situations that are having hardship already know the answers to how they can, how it can be better, they can do better, or how, they can be better assisted. It's just you got to have, so not going in and saying, I think you need to do this and I think you need to do that, rather than saying, well, what do you think would work for you? And having that as a personal, a conversation with that person. So not all First Nations people will all want the same type of, response, or the same type of, what will work for them. So it really does need to be a personalised conversation.
Yeah, thanks, Linda. Yvonne, did you have anything that you wanted to add?
Yeah, I don't really have questions to give, but I'll sort of have principles or things to do, if that makes sense. And I think for me, it's continue to listen to Indigenous people to understand their needs and adapt products, services and supports that are relevant. We use banking language where we need to change the way we communicate messages to Indigenous language. We need to understand the impact of our products and services on communities, and understand that, one size doesn't fit all. So if we can continue to listen and continue on that journey, then things will improve, and people will have more, will be more informed about better opportunities, and also receive products and services that are going to meet their needs. I think the other couple of things is, banks need to continue to play a role in educating communities, and we need to continue to, or people, financial services need to continue to make a commitment to employ Indigenous people, because, with that they bring the lens of understanding how people think about money, and then the types of conversations to have. I think that's really important in terms of the money story. And yeah.
I think especially when it's...
The other thing that would come out of that would be really positive is that you are, for financial services employing First Nations people, you are investing in local community, because those people will go back to their communities, take all that skill and knowledge with them as well. So it's that investment on the ground as well too. So as you say, they will share that information with their families. You did it with your family and friends when you first found out about money. And this is exactly what would happen, in financial services if they're employing, First Nations people. They are actually investing in a local community.
That's great. And yeah, I think especially to all of your points really, where it is that, you know, if you're employing more Indigenous people within your service, it's with the intent of wanting their input and, you know, their expertise and sort of taking it back to their communities and things like that, rather than just having a tick box. So again, it's the intent of that that's so important. I think I'm just having a look at the questions. There's been a comment, Linda, that Lindy loves your background. You were saying before that there's a bit of a story to it. Do you want to give it quickly?
Oh, yes, certainly. So this is some artwork that we had done by a local artist up in Cairns, just to tell the story of our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander network, financial literacy network, I would say, when we had our 10-year anniversary. So we call it ourselves the ATSI network. So it's all financial counsellors and capability workers that work predominantly with our mob on the ground. And in that network, we have about half of those that actually identify as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander, which is fantastic. And so this tells the story of our sector and the work that we're doing with our people on the ground.
I love that. Thanks, Linda. We had a question from Seema asking, what are non-Aboriginal people and systems learning from the non-extractive or sustainable economies that Indigenous people have developed over thousands of years? Do you think that there's been a learning or something being taken on from that? And I guess I would add, what are appropriate ways of going about doing that if that was an intent?
I can give a learning. It's not specifically about relates to that question, but I can give a learning from our bank recently.
That'd be great. Yeah,
it's really a learning for that I shared, and so we had recently an opportunity for an Aboriginal person within MAB to talk at a panel, a corporate affairs panel, and I think the title of the panel was Courage, something like that. So a number of Indigenous, emerging leaders put their hand up, and there was a lady, Lou Lasker from WA, who's a branch manager, and she got the gig, and she spoke at the panel. And what she was able to do was talk about how she was able to support customers who were experiencing vulnerability through a really, really tough time, and was able to draw on her own experience as an Aboriginal woman, and obviously struggles, but also then resilience, and how she was able to use her her personal history and experience and knowledge from that to support, and it wasn't only Indigenous customers she was supporting, it was customers across, who were coming into the branch in crisis and looking for support. And she was able to draw on this. And I think that that is an absolutely excellent example of the rich, not that the experience and expertise of Aboriginal people in dealing with adversity, but also if you bring Aboriginal people into banks, the value add that we can have by bringing in our own personal histories, but also then applying that to broader kind of economic issues that are experiencing all people, not only Indigenous people. And I think that is a real example of the value of having Aboriginal people in roles in the banking sector, and how we can, often people look at the deficits of Aboriginal money or Aboriginal culture, but there is great strengths, and I think I just wanted to share that example. That's something we should be sharing at NAB in terms of we'll look at the additional value add of Aboriginal people working in business, because there's heaps.
Yeah, I love that. Phil or Linda, did you have anything you wanted to add?
Yeah, one of the things that we wanted to do at this year's conference, which has been cancelled because of COVID, was to actually do a remote community visit for executives and CEOs of financial services. So when we first got together with the financial counsellors and capability workers in Darwin about a year and a half ago, we sat down and we said, what city folk don't get? It's simple as that. And we did a whole workshop on it. And from that, all of these issues came out, but also to the positives of celebrating the positive that actually happens in community. Things like the social economy, things like kinship, looking after family, that sort of stuff. is really positive. And I think in terms of, how do you, get to know what community is? And I think important to actually go out and actually visit as a person yourself and just be able to see, what life is like. There are some things that happen and policies and processes that happen within financial services. And we've seen this at Financial Counselling Australia time and time again, where there is a flow-on effect that actually then affects families. So, you might come in and you might see that a family doesn't have any food. Well, the fact they don't have any food is because they've got no electricity, because the community has power cards, and the power cards, they don't always get they don't always get they don't always get updated. Or the fact is that a lot of family are there, and so it's the contract that they're possibly on is not fit for purpose for that family. So to actually get to know what's actually happening in communities is really, it's not just for, I suppose, for executives and CEOs, but it's for anyone that actually wants to understand how communities work.
Yeah, for sure. Bill, did you have anything you wanted to add?
Yeah, I think some of the kind of economic learnings, something we can learn about ourselves, Aboriginal people, and a bit of history, and non-Aboriginal people as well. And that's some of the systems and structures that we had in place. Tribes used to trade goods all the time, like the mob out in Blacktown, Darug, I think it is. They go in and they trade with Gadigal get a bit of seafood and trade for land food. So, we've got that history where we've actually traded resources and made exchanges in a marketplace. It's just changed over the last few years. And you don't live on the driest continent in the world for 60,000 years without being economical or really creative in how you do things. Even though Art was telling me, they had out in the Illawarra area, Thurrowa, if you had to go past there and you're from a different tribe, you'd have what was, there was a white wattle. So you had to have white wattle. So if any fellas from the other tribe asked you what you were doing there, you could show them that, which meant you were there for peace. You'll just kind of pass them by. And that's a old-fashioned way of doing border security as well. So I think understanding that we had these economic things in place in our own sort of way, and it's just kind of encouraging seeing that it's not completely foreign to our culture. We had our own systems and structures economically, but we just got to try and adapt that to sort of a modern way of doing it.
Yeah, I think that really links back to Linda's earlier point about, just the fact that we aren't taught enough about Black Australia history, and, learning that is so important. And just getting an understanding of things like, border control as like something that was being practiced before white people arrived. So I think that's really great. We had a question from Alan, who works with Responsible Investment Association in Australasia. Sorry, Alan, I butchered that. But he was just wondering about what the investment industry could be doing to collectively help advance Indigenous access and economic empowerment.
Don't invest in mining companies that blow up sites is a cool start. That's a bit cheeky.
End session.
Well, that's one of the big things. And we've had super funds come out and say that they'll be no longer investing in these companies because they don't meet that sort of ethically. So that's sort of one thing that's, I don't know if it's an easy win, because not to invest in mining companies that provide a good shareholder return and ultimately the reason you exist is always challenging. But coming from that ethical lens, it shouldn't be sort of a difficult kind of decision. So I think when they're operating in that sense, that can definitely be one of the things they do. Even coming up with a model about investing in some of the Indigenous businesses. Certainly up in the top end where they've got, a lot of land there, they've got the tourist market. I know these guys are probably doing, $50 million plus deals, but there may be an element to the more riskier part of their portfolio or their, where they can allocate 5 to 10% to Indigenous initiatives where the goal isn't a return on investment, but we know that they can employ more Aboriginal people and they can create sustainability within that community. So allocating parts of their portfolio where it's not just monetary based, but there's also impact outcome as well.
Yeah.
That's a really great question, Megan. I think it would be one where, if Alan was agreeable, we could have offline to explore further. If there's some value in that. What do you think, Phil and Linda? I think that would be useful.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah. Yep.
It's definitely a challenging one, but I really like your point, Phil, about, you know, what is it that you're investing? Is it sort of in money or in people? And can it be both, really? Did you have anything that you wanted to add to that one?
The only thing that I was thinking about, because I totally agree with Phil in terms of, you know, investing in as many Indigenous businesses as possible, is don't invest in those businesses that are creating harm. You know, that actually look at businesses and just say, is this business actually doing any good, or is it not? You know, are they fair and equitable? Out there that will always put profit before people.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think one thing that I'm learning as well is just sort of having people that I feel like I can ask, you know, about, you know, this particular company, you know, what's your read on them, sort of thing, like feeling like it's okay to ask those questions rather than trying to potentially muddle through that myself.
Yeah.
We're coming towards the end of the session. I think one thing that would be nice to finish on, I guess, is if the three of you wanted to maybe share a win, like what's an example of a win that you've had in sort of the work that you do? Because I know that it's a lot of challenge, and we've talked about a lot of like things that are to do with barriers and frustrations, but I am hopeful that there are also times where you experience wins as well, and it might be nice to finish up on that if you are comfortable with that.
Yeah, for sure. I can kick off. It comes back to our big Super Day Out events, like that 24 mil across those communities. Even when people find, you know, if you're on the age pension and you find $8,000 to $10,000, that's a great amount. You know, that goes towards a new car, so you can start to travel around a bit more. You can take a holiday rather than, you know, just kind of being in a frugal kind of retirement mindset. So just those easy wins that we get on the ground by bringing everyone together and, you know, really changing people's life. And for us, superannuation is a really big key in intergenerational wealth. Like, it's something that you might be able to pass on, or it's having money there if you do pass away that may cover some costs, or it's got insurance involved. So for us, those wins come from a lot of the super outreach that we do. Yeah.
And can I just follow up on that? So from my understanding of the work that First Nations Foundation does, it's sort of that, you know, there's just not a knowledge that superannuation exists for some people, or like that there's multiple accounts. And is this part of that sort of that jump in financial literacy, or sort of not necessarily having that education that other people might when they start working? Is that what you're seeing, or the particular groups of people that are not knowing about their super?
It's a combination. So, you know, even when you're at like uni and you go through how many different part-time jobs, and then, you know, you're 40, 50 and you realize you've got all these different super accounts, or even when people have retired and they've just forgotten about super that they've had from all those years back. But for us, we make it really, really easy. And identification gets mentioned a lot. So we take Centrelink and Tax Office to people out to the community. So with those two companies, those two, you know, federal government agencies, we can identify people really, really quickly. If we can get them ID through Centrelink, because a lot of them know their CRN, but they mightn't have ID to kind of consolidate their super. So once we get them with Centrelink, hook them up to the tax office and provide that kind of support, we can get those wins really quickly, opposed to, you know, sort of doing that any other way where you have to go to each agency, ring them up and sit on the phone for a while. We just make it super simple.
Yeah, and it definitely sounds like that collaboration between the different organizations and having Centrelink and things like that, like all together, as opposed to everyone trying to silo and do their own thing. Like, that partnership is so important there.
Yeah, and the financial counselling network there as well. But having those conversations when you got, like, you know, 6 or 7 super funds, what do you do then? Like, it's not just a matter of rolling it into one. Yeah. There's all these different considerations as well.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks for sharing that. Yvonne, did you have a win that you wanted to share?
Yeah, I think one of the, from a customer kind of lens, one of the things that we're about to launch very soon is a radio campaign, which will be broadcast through WA, Queensland, and the Northern Territory, which will be all about our Indigenous customer service line, and it'll be in English and in the local language. I think that is really, you know, what we want to do is we want to be able to reduce the blockages, people's understanding about how to actually get who to go to in the bank, and make that support available. Currently, the majority of our support to our Indigenous customer service line comes from Queensland. We think that is because a lot of our marketing initially was first there, but we now have a plan to go broader than that, appreciating that, or realising that we know that people need this support. So I think that is a win for us. And in addition to that, we'll be contacting Aboriginal corporations to advise about the service offerings of that line. And one is, you know, you can actually open a bank account without your 100 points of ID. And for many people, many Aboriginal people, that's a major thing. Not having ID, can't get access to your money, or you've lost your PIN and you can't get access to your money, so you're leaving people destitute. So that's really I think for us that's going to have a huge impact, and we will be measuring the impact that has. But just the reach we're wanting to have, and the fact that it's in language, so meeting Aboriginal people at where they need to be met in terms of information and support.
That's so wonderful, and I think that probably makes Phil and I quite excited, because it links to what we were saying in the money stories, just in terms of identifying barriers to services, and language potentially being one of those things. So that's a fantastic win, and I think that'll be really exciting for people that benefit from that. Linda, did you want to share a win?
I've got a couple. It's really interesting because I actually looked at priorities moving forward. So I have a whole list of those as well, but happy to go with the win. So in terms of our financial counselling and financial capability networks, one of the things that people don't sort of know is that 15 years ago, you could count a First Nation financial counsellor on one hand. 15 years later now, we've got around about 40 to 50 financial counsellors that actually identify as First Nations people. So that's a massive people in a short space of time. We would really love to be able to extend that. And with our capability workers now too as well, there are a lot more First Nations people in those roles as well. I suppose a big win for us in Financial Counselling Australia is the ABA for this year is prioritising Indigenous financial literacy in its work. And so that's going to be amazing that all the banks sit at the table with the ABA in terms of the work that they're doing with First Nations customers on the ground. And so to actually have them identify that as a priority in all the work that the ABA do is really amazing. I suppose the other couple of things that we've had is in particular working with the banks in their Indigenous lines across the board, and working with banks that now want to be able to have an identified line that'll be able to work for First Nations people. So, there's a lot of advocacy work here in terms of all of the identification. So we know that the superannuation services are now looking at a standard form for some of the industry. Superannuation funds are looking at a standard identification form for customers as well. So that's, work that's continuing, but at least the conversation has started.
Absolutely. And I suspect that some of those wins link into priorities that you have, Linda, moving forward as well. There's always more work to be done, hey?
Definitely.
What would you say your top priority is?
I think the top priority needs to be better access to essential financial services with internal processes and policies that are fair and actually suited to the community. For example, we'd love to see the banks do mobile banking out to our remote communities, not as deposit taking, but certainly as, that's going to actually help people, fill in for a new card if they've lost it, open a bank account, all of that sort of stuff. That would be really, really fantastic. I think the other, can I just say two more?
Yeah.
Right. So the other one that we want, and I know that Phil was talking about the big super day out and how wonderful that was. And certainly our financial counsellors participated in those days, and it was amazing. The work that's actually left behind by the financial counsellors for people then that want to have access or early release of their super is just so much work. We actually need at Financial Counselling Australia an industry levy that would actually have some funding to be able to put more people on the ground, to be able to have more financial counsellors, more capability workers out there. We already get, financial counsellors or capability workers. Clients are referred or customers are referred from these services to the financial counsellor with no fee for service. So it's really interesting that we can take this work on, and obviously, we actually need an industry levy to get more boots on the ground. And the other last one is for financial services to partner with translation services in community where English is not spoken as a first language. I think that in terms of getting people to understand what financial products are, they need to be able to understand the language. We know that there are some of the financial services, when someone rings and says they can't speak English because they speak a First Nations language, they're then referred to a interpreter service, which does not
always appropriate. Yeah.
No point in it.
Yeah. Well, those are some really great calls to action, and clearly you have a lot of work set out, but I'm really hopeful that those that have joined us today have found the session useful and interesting. And Rhonda has been sharing some links to the work that Financial Counselling Australia and First Nations Foundation do, and also the NAB Indigenous line. We've also posted some links to the Money Stories report, and then also a fact sheet that we put out earlier this year in terms of identifying Indigenous vulnerability in response to COVID with finances. But we have to wrap up now. Unfortunately, we could talk all day, but thank you so much everyone for your participation. There is a recording that will be going out to you soon, and feel free to share with your networks. We also have monthly webinars coming up, so feel free to visit our website at impact2020.online to see what else is in the works. But otherwise, connect with us on social media, or otherwise feel free to get in touch with me personally if there's anything that you would like to talk about further. But Phil, Linda and Ivan, thank you so much for your time and for your participation. It's so much fun talking to you. And yeah, it's just been a great afternoon. So thank you very much. Thank you to everyone that joined us, and we will hopefully all be in touch together again one day soon. Stay safe, everyone.
Thanks, guys.
Bye.